and programs who have co-sponsored this event. And it's really exciting because it's sort of cross departmental, cross-disciplinary, and it's the way that it should go, in my opinion. So first, I'd like to call on David Pitt.
Hi, I'm David Pitt, and I'm chair of the philosophy department.
Thank you. Ren Heinz.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ren Heinz. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I am the director of the Center for the Study of Genders and Sexualities, and I am also an assistant professor of English. Welcome.
Thank you. Diana Espinoza.
Hi, everyone. I'm Diana Espinosa. I'm a professor in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and I'm just so thankful for this collaboration with various centers and departments on campus. Welcome.
Before I call on Anita, I'm also going to just sort of say that she'll be also making an announcement and doing her land acknowledgement. And then I'll pick it up from there. So, Anita.
Thank you. My name is Anita Tijerina Revilla. I am the chair of Chicanx Latinx Studies, and I'm honored to be here collaborating with my colleagues. Thank you, Dion, for everything you've done to organize this. Y gracias, Norma. We're honored to have you with us.
And Anita, you were going to do the announcement and the land acknowledgement.
Yeah, so we would love to gift you all a book. There will be 3 lucky people who will receive a book of the 40th anniversary of this bridge called My Back. So there's going to be a raffle. So if you'll send me your name to be considered, your name, your email, and contact, send it as a private message so that you can be considered in the raffle. We would love to send it to you after the event. And now I'll read a land acknowledgement. If you could take a deep breath with me. With great respect, Cal State LA acknowledges the Tongva people as the traditional caretakers of Tongmangar, the Tongva world, including the Los Angeles Basin, South Channel Islands, San Gabriel and Pomona Valleys, the portions of Orange, San Bernardino, and Riverside counties. Cal State LA is located within these lands. As an institution located on unceded Tongva land, we pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and our relatives, relations, past, present, and emerging. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold Cal State LA more accountable to the needs of American Indian people. We want to thank our colega, Dr. Kimberly Robertson, and Tongva Elder Julia Bogani. May she rest in power and peace and love. Thank you for this land acknowledgement. And one more quick breath. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anita. And so now it is my pleasure to introduce Ann Garry of the Ann Garry Sharon Bishop Endowed Lecture in Feminist Philosophy. When I first came to Cal State LA a million years ago, actually 20 plus, Ann Garry and Sharon Bishop had built the philosophy department as we know it, and they, to me, were such an inspiration and a support. Here was a strong feminist-led philosophy department that was open and pluralist in nature. At the time, it was like almost an oasis in a desert, and extremely exciting. Anyway, I don't know what I would have done without either Sharon Bishop or Ann Garry, and I'd now like to introduce Ann, who is going to give a little bit, say a few words about the lecture itself, what inspired it.
Hi, I'm Ann Garry. You should be able to see Sharon too. Sharon, if you speak, it'll for sure they can see you. Just say hi or something. Sharon and I endowed the this lecture series when we were retired. And even though Talia said it was an oasis, our department, and in ways, of course, it was, we want to make sure it kept being an oasis of some kind. And so even though we've always had feminists come to talk, and I hope we always will, we thought if we endowed a lecture a year, that would be a good thing. So we've had women of color every year, I think, since we began. And although it was sad during COVID that we couldn't have people in person, we've been very excited the last 2 years to have, this year and last year, to have people on Zoom. And I'm personally very thrilled to have Norma Alarcón because I've known her work forever. And so, Sharon, are you there and can you say hi?
You're muted, Sharon.
Oh, she is here.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Okay, so it is now my pleasure to introduce Dion Espinosa, who will be
concentrated on the modern period or the 20th century.
Who will be introducing Norma Alarcón. I've known Dion almost as long as I've known Anne and Sharon, and it's always been a joy to work with her. And I have to give credit where credit is due. This event would not be possible without the all of the work and organizational ability that Dion put into it. With that in mind, I'm going to sign off and pass this off to Dion.
Thank you so much, Talia, and I'm just so grateful for my collegial community that you are very much a part of at Cal State LA. That's why we can do events like this. We have tremendous teamwork, so thank you, Ren, Talia, Anita, David, who's doing some of the tech work for us today, and Anne, Garry, and Sharon Bishop, and I definitely want to shout out Anne as somebody who has really supported me at Cal State LA as a Chicana, a young woman of color, and I appreciated that support. Even if it meant getting at one point saying, it's your turn to direct the Center for the Study of Genders and Sexualities. But, we need people who see us that way and, support our leadership. So thank you for that, Anne. So I want to start with a personal note. And I want to tell you, and it's kind of like a full disclosure, really, that I first met Norma when I was an undergraduate at UC Berkeley in the late 80s. And in fact, it's kind of her fault in a good way that I chose to go on to doctoral studies. Her arrival at UC Berkeley influenced me tremendously. And I took a Chicano literature class with Dr. Alarcón, and just seeing her standing in front of the classroom showed me indeed that Chicanas can be professors. Throughout her career, she's mentored countless graduate students, mostly women of color, and many Chicanas in her career, and many of them are probably here. So if you want to put something in the chat and let us know you worked with Doctora Norma Alarcón, Profa Norma Alarcón, that would be great. And so she has really inspired all of us with her fearless Chicana feminist analysis. She's part of the generation that helped to build the Chicana professorial pipeline. So it's my honor to introduce Dr. Norma Alarcón. She is Professor Emeritus at UC Berkeley, where during her over 20 years, she was a faculty member in Chicano Studies, Comparative Ethnic Studies, Gender and Women's Studies, and Spanish. She is currently visiting professor at Brandeis University in the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality. So part of why Dr. Alarcón is here has to do with the fact that we are in the 40th anniversary of This Bridge Called My Back, right? The first publication was 1981 with Persephone Press, 1983 with Kitchen Table Women of Color Press. So I kind of feel like 2021 to 2023, we should be lifting up Bridge as much as possible. and every day, really, right? So Let me tell you something about Alarcón's genealogy in relation to this bridge called My Back, Writings by Women of Color, or what we often call Bridge, right? And it's a genealogy related to bridge, women of color feminisms, and the intersection of theory and praxis. Sorry. So let me say a bit about her connections as appropriate for Women's History Month and in honor of the 40th anniversary of Bridge. So first, people need to know that Doctora Alarcón founded Third Woman Press in the Women of Color 80s, as I call it, as a press devoted to the publication of works by and about women of color. Third Woman Press published iconic works.
I did not know at that point that you were moving to San Bernardino, but you were very frustrated.
Okay, thank you for that. And I knew who that was too. I'm going to have to give him a hard time later. Anyway, as I was saying, so Norma founded Third Woman Press as a press devoted to publication of works by and about women of color. Third Woman Press published iconic works such as, and I'm going to have to do a show and tell, Chicana Lesbians, The Girls Our Mothers Warned Us About, edited by Carla Trujillo. This is the original cover. She also published a journal, The Third Woman, that featured a special issue on Latinas and sexuality. And until 2008, Third Woman Press published the third edition of this bridge called My Back. So here's the third edition of this bridge called My Back. In addition to being a publisher, Alarcón has also been a translator. She and writer Ana Castillo translated this bridge called My Back to Spanish as Esta Puente, Mi Espalda, Voces de Mujeres Tercermundistas en los Estados Unidos. So that's praxis. A lot of that is a praxis in terms of publishing, right? And getting, the words of women of color, Chicanas, out. So secondly, I want to talk about Dr. Alarcón's intellectual biography, which is extensive, and it would be hard to do justice to mapping this out. So I'm going to make a selective note on work that is directly connected to Bridge. Alarcón published an essay in Bridge entitled Chicanas Feminist Literature, a Revision through Malincin, Putting Flesh Back on the Object. The piece raised a central topic of Alarcón's body of critical thought, Chicana agency and subjectivity. In the essay, which is a dense and layered analysis, Alarcón starts with Malincin, the indigenous enslaved woman who lived in the 1500s, and is often characterized as the traitor who contributed to the downfall of the Aztec Empire. Exploring the masculinist mythology that surrounds Malincin, she powerfully unpacks the dynamics of patriarchy and colonialism and reads through Chicana poetry to draw out the forms of subjectification that operate to keep Chicanas in their place. From this essay to subsequent essays, Alarcón's body of work consistently explores the possibilities of women of color and Chicana agency, resistance, visibility, transformation, and coalition within systems of racialization, gender, and capitalism. And increasingly, she's looking at neoliberal capitalism. Okay, I'm wrapping it up. I know, it's difficult, right? Wow, I'm wrapping it up. Okay. Alarcón stands out among Chicana theorists for her central engagement with post-structuralist theory from a Chicana feminist perspective to create a uniquely Alarconian approach. An example of this can be found in her landmark essay, The Theoretical Subjects of This Bridge Called My Back and Anglo-American Feminism. This essay surveys the impact of Bridge and questions Anglo-American feminism for its refusal to consider the limitations of its paradigms for understanding women of color lives. In fact, Alarcón's writing coincides with the rise of intersectionality by the late 80s, so kind of expanding genealogies of intersectionality. In Theoretical Subjects, she states, current political practices in the United States make it almost impossible to go beyond an oppositional theory of the subject, which is the prevailing feminist theory and that of others. However, it is not the theory that will help us grasp the subjectivity of women of color. Socially and historically, women of color have been now central, now outside antagonistic relations between races, classes, and genders. This struggle of multiple antagonisms, most always in relation to culturally different groups and not just genders, gives configuration to the theoretical subject of Bridge. Mic drop. One may wonder how this conversation about feminist theory or other liberatory theories and their framing of or invisibilization of women of color and Chicanas continues to develop currently. Today, Dr. Alarcón is going to speak to the current conversation about decolonial theory and women of color in her talk, Towards Grounding Decoloniality. Welcome, Norma Alarcón.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, as you know, the title of my paper is supposed to be Towards Grounding Decoloniality. And I may be in error, you can correct me, but at this point I have not seen anyone talk about the decolonial or decolonization or decoloniality from the point of view of how the hell do you do that when it's not a question of, let's say, a nation state acquiring independence from an empire or a colonizer. We're talking here about a decoloniality that, in fact, I've decided to make a frame of intelligibility in order to understand what we have in many ways already have done, that is, decolonized in the personal or rather ontological sense. So, in order to better understand what follows, I worked out a paradigmatic framework. I want to limit my view of the formation of the nation state to the United States of America, which from its inception fashioned itself as an empire, as an imperialist power, parallel to the Spanish imperialist power of the time, which was still extant as an empire at the time of independence of the new insurgents to the British Empire. After the multiple wars that the new insurgents won by 1776, the venerable patriarchs of the time gathered to invent themselves philosophically, structurally, and politically. It was a right that the papal doctrine of discovery had granted all the Christian white men of that time. They were given permission, as had the Spanish before them, to take all lands of the infidels that were not Christian, not human. If not Christian, you were not human, and were deemed savages. Christianity at that time was civilization for them. So it is most appropriate at this moment in time to start with 1776, since for the white nativist Christians of our times, American history starts there. It is their myth and mythology, the main narrative they want children to learn, as well as soon the colleges and universities. In the parlance of our times, the United States of America became a post-colonial state in 1776. As such, their nation building became the main project. They were believers of manifest destiny. Of course, the idea that the new nation state would be post-colonial along with the rest of the hemisphere is not as it were, adopted at all. However, one of the instruments of a continued colonialism now in new hands was the promotion of European immigration and also generate an entrepreneurial class by enabling settler colonialism in the 19th century. Protected often by the army, these white settler colonialists were a privileged class who waged wars against Mexicans indigenous, Chinese, and other race ethnics. The West was won by force. However, the event of decolonization in symbiosis with postcoloniality is constituted by the white men of privilege that will conduct the nation-building project, and it will be ensure that the white man will be in charge. In the process of nation building, many people of color, non-white, became part of the landscape in the process of expansion. That is to say, the existence of race ethnicities had been present even before the official founding date. Other groups may have other points of entry in that historical weave. As long as race minorities were numbered by whites, things were okay. However, the number of race minorities has increased, and the white supremacist Christians are in a panic. We of color induce the panic because we are proof positive that this country is a multilingual, multicultural, multiracial, multigendered, and queer nation. Moreover, we appear too numerous for their taste. Thus, at this moment, we are targets of suppression and repression to the extent possible. The ultimate aim is to bring us into subjection and submission to the labor forces, protocols, and the neoliberal capitalist face of subjugation. As such, we are pressed to initiate a political movement whose aim is akin to that rebellion of the masses that we experienced in the 20th century, mid-century. Those of us who inhabit the internal colonies of the U.S., today we are living in a state of emergency, and we have to rethink the tactics and strategies in the activist resistance to authoritarianism, a neo-colonizing force. It is those internal colonies, or ghettos, if you will, or colonias, that led civil rights activism and movements throughout the country in the 20th century. From the fields to the cities, from the underclass to the middle class and more, we underwent a rebellion of the masses in the sense of the proletariat, the intellectuals, and students. It is this rebellion en masse that provided the contemporary roots of many a woman of color, which at the time was called U.S. Third World Feminism, and in the 80s came to be called Third Wave Feminism, although that title seems to have dropped out of the discourse for lack of historical notation. Okay, so now I want to move over to another section of my paper that begins with "Without a Word to My Name," an exercise in poiesis. Poiesis. I didn't practice that much. In the 80s, in the 60s, and the 1970s, after the epical civil rights politics of the era swept by, the zeitgeist of the times found a permanence in my being for that spirit, that political spirit. I realized that I did not have a word to my name, as if to say, without a penny to my name. Language has a kinship to the idea of the coin of the realm, for the realm is spun out from language itself. How to speak of the unspeakable in the public sphere. Though I had not yet heard of Sycorax, Caliban's mother, and The Tempest by Shakespeare, what was that? I felt as if I too had been left without language. So Juana Inez once said, "It is not that there is nothing to say, it is what there is to say cannot find its way into words themselves. That is, I have no available language with which to say what I cannot yet say." Or as an 11-year-old told me once, "I wish I had the words for all the images in my head." It was not a case of having no words available to me. I was a graduate student. It was the case that those words were not mine. That is why I had no words of my own. They were not of my own making, for my self-expression. One learns language through mimesis imprinted on us by our caregivers. Language is a tool that becomes part of our heteropatriarchal legacy. When we are conquered, enslaved, genocided, or colonized, it is quite a job to pursue and find one's own voice, to be a speaking subject in the public sphere. The language that has constructed us as women, and especially women of color in a racially stratified social economy, is to be reworked and rescued from the trash bin of a mutilated history. We want to peel off that language from the abuse subjected and raped body. We want to live in a society whose main organizing principle, we continue to live in a society whose organizing principle is race, gender, and labor. Not professional work, but the harsh labor of the underclass and working classes. One option is to use language against itself, relocate it, rearrange it. The poiesis that excavates our being for our own voice. One is always on the hunt for the fit that suits or the suit that fits, a continuous making and unmaking. Most of the feminists of color of that era, as well as some white women, shared at least 3 conceptual strategies for liberation. Consciousness racing, a Freudian idea of the times, the personalist political, and identity politics. All of these emblematic working concepts guided the great disidentification or oppositional consciousness that at the time all women shared. However, the potential alliance crumbled in the face of differences that could not be overcome. Women of color could not agree with white women that sex, as it was called at the time, gender had not been introduced yet as a concept for use, was the universal and principal concept that colligated women in general universally. That could not be a unifying common denominator, that is sex, or as it was called at the time, or gender as we call it today, could not be a unifying common denominator that could produce an oppositional paradigm in opposition to heteropatriarchy. This collapse, due to white women's pursuit of universality and patriarchal style by the end of 20th century, came to be called a theoretical apartheid by Chela Sandoval in her methodology of the oppressed. In effect, that book, that is Sandoval's book, gathered up all the activism, practical and rhetorical, that had been produced by women of color in the previous decades, of especially the 70s and the 80s. The majority of feminist women of color in Bridge and others as well of those times came from urban and rural ghettos, what I am calling internal colonies, by virtue of poverty and racism, that is, race ethnic communities. These underserved, abandoned, and ignored ghettos were called internal colonies by some of the scholars of the time, and most especially Chicanos and Puerto Ricans, but others agreed as well. That name for the ghettos was generally adopted, though at the time, and even now, I think it appropriate. Though it has not become part of the primary critical discourse of our times, mainly because the United States does not see itself as a colonialist power within its own territory. But it is. For Bridge, contributors who stated up front their existential contradictions in our society, the feminists of their communities, the lesbians of the movements, and it became a great import to call for the assessment of lived experience in a holistic way. As the Combahee River Collective stated at the time, that they stated that there was a need to attain autonomy as well as have linked to the critique and solidarity with their own communities. It was necessary to discover our deeper feminist desires as well as verbalize the needs of the communities they called home, to structurally and substantially take into account the status of colonized race ethnicities. Thus, the autonomous voices of radical women of color who wanted to clarify for themselves the politics to take on would become the voices of the new emergent feminist political subject. It is important to note that many white feminists of the time and even later read bridge as the rhetoric of victims, while the writers themselves were producing the language needed to construct their own subjectivities and subject positions in the public sphere. As such, this work opened the doors to the youth of the time that needed validation of their own lived experiences, one's own sense of self, past, present, and future. It was a novel idea to enter the public sphere and be able to articulate who one was and what thought one was. Speaking, writing, and reconstructing oneself and the multiple forms of lived experience in what was called at the time the belly of the beast, meaning an imperialist power. That is the imperial nation state of which we were part, the practice and writing of the ontological project. Now, I must elaborate that some of the contributors to Bridge, such as Rosario Lawrence Morales and Gloria Ansaldúa, were registered protests about the epistemological labels that were being, as it were, offered to women of color to adapt for themselves or to tell them who they were. And they protested. They did not want to adapt that epistemological project. They wanted to discover the epistemology of that they needed and wanted in order to express that lived experience. Thus, the autonomous voices of radical women of color who wanted to clarify for themselves the politics to take on, those protests with respect to the fact the epistemologies offered to the contributors were in quest of one's own. The women of color not just limited, who were not propel what at the time was called third wave feminism. In a sense, the 70s and the 80s, after participation in the civil rights movement of mid-century and further, they addressed the community issues. They wanted to become autonomous and at the same have solidarity with communities and simultaneously find a self-definition and a form of self-determination, and to name and find a language with which to name that experience. Then, bridge contributors like, no, I'm sorry.
Has the video frozen, or is it just me?
It's frozen.
It's frozen.
Dr. Alarcón, are you experiencing some internet instability? If so, maybe turn off your video for a little bit so you can just read the papers so that it won't freeze. I don't know if she can hear me.
Yeah, I don't know if she's still, oh, it looks like she's gone.
Well, she'll be back.
Yeah, oh, there she is. Oh, I saw her. Okay, yeah, she's coming back.
Where am I? Where am I in this?
You're on. You're on,
Yeah,
Dr.
you're
Alarcón.
back. And I think the last point you were saying was to find the name and language with which to name that experience.
Of the notion of difference, of making a point that that our difference, that the difference was what
Okay, I think it went off again.
in part I did that because he facilitated.
Norma, we're still not hearing you.
Could Norma, if you can hear us, I wonder if you could get Joe to see if he could troubleshoot, because it seems that you're cutting in and out, even with the video off.
And
okay, you're back. You're back. We hear you.
Okay, and decided to adopt the Jacques Derrida's notion of difference for myself, because I wanted to use that as a weapon, as a kind of rhetorical weapon, actually, with the binary logic or oppositional logic that we are presented with. For example, that's already
We're still having a struggle. I'm
binary logic of oppositional consciousness to the and in the end, engaging with that binary logic rather than taking it apart. Although other women of color have called it, Gloria Antaldúa talks about reason with a capital R, enlightenment, conceptualizations, which is part, it continues to be part of our society, as you can see. How people today are bullying each other with a binary logic in which you can only blame each other, and you cannot get out of that bind as each takes up a position. While Jacques Derrida's notion of difference enables us, if we take it out of the rhetorical plane, which is of course perhaps something that some people would not approve of, but as I said, it is an exercise in poiesis, which I believe in, because it is that making that poiesis enables, a derivative of, or rather poetry is a derivative of that. It is the inventiveness that provides that enables us to make a language of one's own to extent possible. And to, as it were, get rid of the epistemology that we are heir to and form our own as we do the work of listening and reading women in general, I would say, and women of color specifically, depending on your focus. I think that all of these women that contributed to Bridge and before and after are now, for your information, being read in South America and in Mexico and other parts that have any platform for women's studies, or and they're all activist scholars. They're all activist scholars, and in a sense, trying to come out from under the rhetorical weight of our legacy is needs to be appended, to continually be questioned and eliminated from our vocabulary if necessary. Certainly that's the problematic I faced in the 70s, when I realized that, hey, the language was all borrowed. It preceded me. It was there, it preceded me. Not only that it precedes me in the household, it precedes me in school and society. Consequently, there was this need to as it were, shake up the building, the structure, the rhetorical structure provided, and shake it up as much as one could. For me, Derrida's own philosophical critique and analysis enabled me, for example, to question the binary logic of essentialism and anti-essentialism, rather than to deploy it as if it was a truism forevermore, and to, as it were, avoid the binary logic that demands, just like other like reason and sensibility becomes also a binary logic that one can engage in, or an oppositional logic that one can engage with and not necessarily get any ground. In a sense, what I also want to add is that much of the work done on decoloniality does not focus on the fact that people have already been doing this, because the initial kickoff for persons that have written about this, and this includes, unfortunately, Maria Lugones as well, do not give us the tools that were used and that could be used for that form of self-decolonizing. Okay, and we cannot take this particular gesture as part of getting independence from your colonizer, which is what's happening with Ukraine right now. Russia doesn't want it to be independent. Just not to go any further, just not be independent of control of Russia. But once you acquire that, the act of self-decolonization takes other forms. The geopolitical decolonization is kind of an understanding between states that you are now independent. But that doesn't mean that the people are. In fact, what happens, from my point of view, is that the conquerors or the invaders become settler colonialists. So in the case of the Spanish Empire, those that remained in the empire were now becoming agents of the state and continue to be settler colonialists, which had been granted to them before. And so I thought it would be useful to see the various tools and activities that Bridge contributors engaged in to make the case that this in itself was a decolonizing move, such as the mid-century civil rights movements and so on that went on to our times become a decolonizing move. I mean, getting the vote, 1965. Taking the vote away, 2022, which is part of the reason I claim that we are being targeted in the suppression of the vote, and that acquiring the vote in mid-century, last century, was a decolonial move to be an active participant, as become a true citizen. Okay, and that's what was lacking, citizenship with respect to the women of color I'm talking about, and the kinds of activities, activisms, and rhetorical announcements and self-definitions that we see during that period of time. By the 90s, that lesson sort of had been learned, and feminism begins to take other turns. Feminism itself begins to take other turns. Not necessarily that of women of color, but certainly of the majority of the white feminism that we see. And unfortunately, what could have been an alliance, having had similar tools, fell apart. And as we know, Chela Sandoval called it theoretical apartheid between white feminism and feminism of women of color. I'll stop there. I just thought that the decolonial theorists have not taken into account with enough detail that people can understand what they're talking about, what can make the claim that a people have decolonized themselves. And moreover, this was by way of entry into the political sphere. That was very important. Become a subject and a citizen in the political sphere. That becomes a very important part of this.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Norma.
Well, anyway, that's as far as I've gotten with the ideas on this subject. Perhaps you have some to offer me to continue with.
Well, thank you so much, Norma. And once again, we're so sorry this happened. And I want to, anyone who's here also say sorry that we had to all collectively experience that. And that's why I put in the chat, like we're talking about being targeted. Well, clearly we're being targeted for the kinds of thinking that we're doing that doesn't conform to dominant, holding up white supremacist capitalist patriarchy to lift up bell hooks there. So I remember, Norma, you said you were interested in conversation. So I really want to open it up. And I feel like you touched on a lot of things that we can sort of pick up and discuss and unpack a bit more. So we want to welcome questions. You can raise your hand or you can put a question in the chat. And so while you're raising your hand or putting the question in the chat, I also want to remind you that we have copies of This Bridge Called My Back, the fourth edition now, no, fifth, is it the fourth or I think it's the fifth edition now, with a beautiful yellow cover published by Feminist Press now. We have copies of those available, so you can direct message Anita Revilla and share your information, letting her know you want to be part of a raffle for a copy of This Bridge Called My Back. So are there any questions in the, any questions either in the chat or, okay, Talia, great, you're the first one.
Thank you for your talk, and it's so fascinating, and I'm so sorry about what happened. I can't wait to read the whole paper. One of the things that I found fascinating was, you alluded to sort of, this critique of Lugones for not sufficiently providing the content, I guess, of self-decolonization. And so the question I wanted to ask you is whether or not, it seems to me that her earlier work, is of a piece with her later work. And so certainly there is a sense in which, sort of drawing on this idea of resistance and sort of being the necessary response to oppression, as it always happens, right? And then drawing on folks like Enzo Dua and this notion of the germinative status. She's got the notion of complex communication. So I'm just wondering why you think that she doesn't have the tools to be able to explain the possibilities of decolonization or self-decolonization.
Oh, you mean Lugones?
Yeah.
I think she does in some senses. For example, she has the concept of that she introduces in an earlier work before uh, she took on the notion of decolonial. She has some earlier work in which she talks about the persona of the streetwalker as a critical person, as a critical entity.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a very interesting idea that she had, because it had to do with going to the ground level of research, if you will, and that can only be done on that can be done on that ground by way of self-transformation, or with others. And but when she did the other work on the decolonial, she was trying to do something that I wouldn't have recommended myself, and that is to pay homage to the men, to the patriarchs that had been working with colonialism, the coloniality of power, something like that, the Quijano and others that were doing the theory, but were not getting down into the practices, and her having to translate them to her own thinking, including including the way in which she engages gender, did not give her the opportunity to then go back to the streets.
Yeah, that's interesting. Can I ask then, because I mean, I've always been trying to read Lugones charitably about her views on gender when she gets to, you know, the decolonial turn. And after talking to enough people, I realized that I can't or shouldn't read her charitably. You know, so for example, the possibility that gender could be resignified. And so are you suggesting then that that is precisely symptomatic of the move, and that she sort of forgoes the kind of resistant practices of self-transformation that she would have countenanced earlier? Is that?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Okay.
Because earlier on, she had created a critical persona on the figure of the streetwalker. And this was by way of not only getting closer to the streetwalker herself, the actual streetwalker, but also to be able to get into conversation with someone in which she could speak freely. Because at the time she was hiding something. I'm not quite sure what it was. She does signal that she was hiding something, and she adopted this persona in order to demonstrate the circularity of going from the street to jail to asylums to and so on. I think she had had a breakdown of some sort and could not find anyone to speak with at all, and except the streetwalker. And this
I mean, she was literally on the street talking to people when she did this, right?
Exactly. And that's where she came up with this notion. And she puts it in a footnote, which is kind of a mistake in my part, because it is a whole paradigm for the critical persona that she's invented, and that led her to the streets to talk to strangers in ways that she could not talk to, let's say, her peers. Okay? So this is, for me, you know, it seemed to me that what she wanted to do was write her own essay for bridge. If you have a breakdown and you can't talk to your peers, who are you going to talk to? You talk to those that are already marginalized totally, you know, like a streetwalker whose openings are only jail at some point, and fortunately and hopefully not a sentence, a long sentence. But she found this very rewarding that she adapted the critical persona of the streetwalker, but did not necessarily return to the street to talk to those people.
It's very helpful.
But it's very, so when she, in the 2010 essay that she has on decoloniality, she spends a lot of time trying to tell us what the guys are doing. And apparently the only error the guys made was not to include gender in their meditations. But I think it's more than that. It's more than gender. It's sexuality, it's poverty, it's lots of other things that go on in the streets that, in a sense, are sometimes a protest to achieve kind of distance from those that dominate you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I can't wait to read your chapter on this.
Yeah, well, I have it. I didn't write out my thinking because I didn't, with respect to how I could not really use her for my purposes. Because my purposes, as I tried to make clear in my paper, is to divulge the kinds of tools that people use for self-decolonization and to enter the public sphere.
Got it.
And as a citizen, and this is why I also call them a new emergent political subjects.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So Norma, I had a different question, and once again, I want to put comments in the chat or questions, raise their hand. But maybe because of the glitching, I wanted to hear a little bit more about what you said was the idea of third wave not really being carried out. And on some level, I guess I'll just say my feeling that, women of color, like what does women of color theory look like today? What's the unfinished project of Bridge, I guess, is what I want to say. And then when you're speaking to this idea of like the rebinarizing of politics, what would you say is the potential way out of that?
Out of what? The binary law?
The binaries, yeah, kind of the law. I don't know. I feel like there's, and once again, I maybe I'm just completely wrong. Maybe not looking, because I see it in the activist spaces, definitely. And what does the Women of Color Project look like now? I guess is what I'm saying. 40 years after Bridge, what does it look like in the academy now? And what does it look like in relation to, I guess, the street politics or on the ground, and this idea of the, unfinished idea of third wave feminism that you mentioned?
Well, the idea of third wave feminism was dropped as a concept when the 80s were over and the 90s arrived with new feminist theories for us to undertake. Okay, and especially new feminist theories that came to dominate the women's studies department, which at the time did not have enough women of color within them. I think that now there are some women's studies and sexuality studies departments that have introduced more women of color that can bring into view the development they have the development they have made along what is the project of feminist women of color. And I think the most I find political figures in the nation state that we currently enjoy. I find political figures coming from the most outstanding political figures in the actual nation state today are the squad that Trump hated so much. The representatives in Congress that Trump hated so much, and who call themselves the squad, and it's made up of Puerto Rican, African American, Palestinian, I think. No, not Palestinian. Two Muslim and Muslim African American. Ilan Omar, I'm talking about. Now, these to me are very impressive, progressive political figures that actually made it, if you will, into politics themselves. I find other women of color, there are many Latinas in Congress, but they're not, they have yet to achieve the political public voice so that they can be more participatory in the public sphere, if you will. And but that's politics, I mean official politics, if you will. But I think, personally, I think that that right now the most important project, I think, for women of color in the United States is to form a third world alliance of various forms and declare an abolition of violence, global violence against women, which is getting very, very serious. I mean, the war against women is not just violence, it's also disenabling them, their citizenship itself. And this is coming on as well with respect to many of us, because I do not know how one can restore the ethnic knowledges that were introduced in K-12, which are being right now excised from the bookshelves of the K-12 curriculum. They're being taken out of the libraries and so on and so forth, and also the language is being censored. They make long lists of words that cannot be used, and limiting all a lot of material on sexuality and race, so that one is never quite decolonized. That's part of mine as such, because I think that women in general, and I mean white and of color, as well as race, ethnicities, sensualities, are really, really being targeted with suppression and repression right now as we speak. And if things go the way I kind of sense it, it's going to get worse. So that means that we have to prepare for, we may not call it that, we may not call it another decolonizing move, but the point is that in being repressed, one has to unrepress again, and it takes movements, it takes activism, it takes a change of rhetoric, and also a change of epistemology. You can see the binary logic at work between the two parties, which gets the rest of us that are being suppressed and repressed nowhere. And nor does the social media platforms in which everybody engages in the same way. I mean, it's kind of weird. But I think the project is a project, for me, at this point in my life, is against violence, global violence of all women and sexualities. And it pertains to the United States as well as every other country globally. It's a global project. And as far as literary criticism, it has grown in many multiple ways, but I am concerned that the political figures that I see on the ground are activists around a variety of multiple issues that still assail the country. Activists about Roe versus Wade, again, after 50 years, again. The activists vis-a-vis immigration, again. And others who are very skillful at mounting these movements, and that we obviously need to do again.
Thank you. You know, Norma, Ann Garry had a question, so I'm going to call on Ann. Ann, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I put my question. Well, first of all, I really enjoyed your talk, and I'm sorry for the computers going in and out, and then the Zoom bombing. That was terrible, but I think we carry on, and that's good. The question I put in chat, I want to change a little bit. So given what you think the most important project is now for women of color, how might we have gotten here sooner if people in the United States had been willing to acknowledge that we had internal colonies?
Well, people in the United States know that they had ghettos and
Yeah.
Of various ethnic persuasions. But I think that it would have been startling to Anglo-Europeans in general if it had been called more widely, more broadly, rather than sort of scholarship pushed to the corner. If they had been told more widely in the front of the New York Times, these are our internal colonies.
Yeah, I mean, I think so too.
Calling attention to that. I think that, but the United States has never wanted to acknowledge even that it is an imperialist power.
Imperialist, right.
Period. And right now it doesn't seem to accept the fact that they are homophobic, racist,
yeah,
and so on, and it becomes very difficult.
Yeah, well, one of the things I was thinking was it would be if we had been able to acknowledge widely that we were a colonial power with internal colonies, then the liberal sort of rhetoric of, well, we can all be equal if we just level the playing field and it's going to be easy to do, which of course it isn't and hasn't been working. That might have been easier to undercut.
Well, it would have definitely given us a different conversation.
Yeah, yeah.
A much more different conversation that may have been adjusted depending, because the social movements of the mid-last century all emerged as diverse race ethnic entities who did not even, perhaps in many circumstances, know each other as groups.
Right.
Okay? And although the movements themselves brought people in proximity to each other, and this is one of the reasons why I hope that the Black Lives Matter marches of 2020, I was very happy to see that there was a mixed crowd,
right.
A very mixed crowd. But the question I kept asking myself is, are they talking to each other? Are they becoming friends so that they can talk to each other and, in a sense, develop a political group? Because most of them were young people. I think they were what they call millennials and Gen Z, and there were some oldsters in the mix, some older people in the mix. If they could walk all those miles, I couldn't, but I enjoy watching the crowd and discerning the differences amongst them, and I kept hoping that they talked with each other. I mean, after all, it was a whole summer and a lot of activity. So I don't know, but
thanks.
Yeah, I had another question, but if someone else had one, I'm willing to cede to somebody else. Oh, Esperanza, yes, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Esperanza, she, her pronouns. I am on Phoenix, also known as, I had to look it up, Akimel Orkham tribe and the Okoham people. Thank you to all the organizers here, and thank you for having us back. I went to go walk my dog, and then I heard a text we were back, so I'm like, gorgeous. And thank you, Norma, for being here with us and sharing your perspective. Mm-hmm. I think something that I'm trying to do with my thinking and writing is thinking how I, as a trans Latina, fit into all of this. I think sometimes I find myself frustrated within trans studies because it feels like there's it feels like homogeneously as trans people we have similar experiences, but like I know as a trans Latina, like we have very different material realities. How do you view this conversation of grounding decoloniality with trans studies? If you want to share, or you can share your musings about this also.
Let me ask you, what do you mean by trans Latina?
So I'm transgender and I'm Latina, and my family's from Zacatecas, Mexico.
Okay, you mentioned an indigenous group, and I thought maybe that was also part of your genealogy. No.
Yeah, a part of what I'm trying to do with my work is think about hemispheric indigenous people's connection to Latinidades. So like thinking within critical Latinx indigeneity.
Okay. Well, the question was whether this notion of decolonial and its practices and methods would be useful to you. Is that it? Is that the question?
I'm sorry, can you repeat your question for me?
Are you asking if practices of decolonialism, decolonizing, would be useful to what you are trying to develop?
Yes, I think they are, but I'm figuring that out.
Yes. Well, I think that at this particular moment, even by as it were calling yourself trans, that you have already been doing some of the basic work, which is looking deep down into yourself, as the women of the Combahee River Collective mentioned, looking deep down into yourself and be able to clarify for yourself your needs and what your politics will be with respect to those needs, to respect to achieving that a full citizenship regardless of your identity. And so you already, from my point of view, you already started on the project. And you are continuing to do that by way of, you can continue, what is that? There's some cartoon on my screen. Now there is a person. Okay, Linda, okay. Where did you go that I was talking with? Esperanza, right. That part of it now entails, I think, to continue dialogues with your alliances in South America. And I know that you will find those alliances because I am aware of multiple groups, activist groups throughout South America and in Costa Rica and other places, including trans women, and who are Latinas. And I think the reason for the alliances is not only so that you know ourselves and share your findings with respect to your needs, and when they become political issues and you're ready to go into the public sphere with them, then you, as it were, go into the public sphere as a full citizen demanding your civil rights. But now you know what the issues are for you because you have done the exploratory work. And as it were, get a load off your shoulders of a lot of language that is of no use to you to become who you are. Do you follow me on that? There's a lot of language that is no use to us and that is weighing us down. And the only way we find this out is by rifling through it. I don't know, was that?
Yeah, that was really helpful. Thank you, Norma.
Okay.
So we have a couple questions, and I think, is it okay if we go maybe 5 minutes over just because of the disruption that we experienced, 5 to 10 minutes over, so we could hear these two questions. These will be our last two comments. So David Pitt and then Jennifer Vess, Lisa Vess.
Thank you very much, Norma, for your talk. I learned a lot, and I was wondering what sort of role, and if there has a role, how big a role, the with respect to the what seems to be a resurgence of sort of radical right wing thought and the kind of explicit, unabashed racism that Trump unleashed upon our country. I wonder if you think that some of that, or a contributing factor to the sort of doubling down on that, is the recognition that things really are changing, and that the age of dominance for, say, white European straight males or whatever is coming to an end. And we see, America, white people in America will soon be not the majority. Maybe they're not. We're not already. And I wonder how you see, if you see at least part of what's happening now as sort of a last gasp or a struggle of the final struggle.
Well, I hope it is the final struggle and not, if you will, a tsunami that will bury us for decades and decades, which is something I fear for all of us. For all of us, white men or women of color, because it appears to me that at this particular point in time that the white extremists that are Trump followers and that the Republican Party tolerates or wants amongst them and cheers amongst them are willing to have in power an authoritarian person, be it Trump again or DeSantis, who is a candidate out there in the right-wing stratosphere, and that they are willing to undergo an authoritarian government. They want that more than us. They want to be put in our place, whether you're a white liberal male or whether you're left the squad in Congress or out in the street. They want us to shut up and stop disturbing their sense of their identity, which, as I said in the beginning of my paper, for them begins in 1776.
Yes, and so it's like they don't know what they're asking for. They really want to live in a totalitarian state. This has been bewildering to me.
It is bewildering to me too, because they have serious contradictions with themselves. Because the base is that, as people talk about the base, they are working class men and women. They are not the rich. They are not the elite. And they have protested. The reason they protest against the Clintons is because they see them as responsible for everything that's happening to us, including the neoliberal capitalism that is part of our new order, structural order of the political economy, globally. I mean, Biden wouldn't be able to do what he's doing if this weren't already so global and so interconnected. They're against globalization, which doesn't look to me it's going to happen anytime soon. But if they get their authoritarian candidate, they may rearrange the structure that is currently in place for neoliberal capital. I have no idea. There's a lot of silly things going on with this group of extremists. But what they want more than anything, their country back, their notion of their country back. And apparently our number, that is the number of raised people, many of whom are here anyway because the United States as an imperial power was over there, wherever, for example, I'll just go with the Vietnamese for now as part of the cadre of immigrants that came in the late 60s and 70s and so on as a result of that war. And think of all the others that have gone on and what has happened as a result. So they don't make sense. They don't make sense. The only thing that makes sense is their mission. Because you can see it. You can see them working out their mission and using all the tools at their disposal to control us. To control us as much as they can. And to make it legal, because that's part of the farce of this new modernity. To play it by the book legally, even though it's not quite by the book. It's looking to see the loopholes in which the law can be manipulated for their own ends. And what else can I say?
Thank you. Jennifer Lisa Vest has a question.
Thank you.
What? Is that my Jennifer?
Yes, yes, I'm yours. It's so good to see you.
I never thought I would ever see you again. It's been so long. The last time I heard you were in Florida. Where are you now?
I'm in Berkeley.
Oh, good. Where in Berkeley? Are you at UCB?
No, I escaped academia. I escaped academia.
Yeah, well, sometimes it becomes hard, doesn't it? As much as we love it, it becomes hard.
Yeah, yeah. I'm still writing, but I actually wanted to start my question off with a tribute, with a love song. Professor Alarcón, you taught me so much. I've always learned so much from you. I'm learning from you still. You know, you were my first professor, my first semester in my first year of my PhD program. And we came to class and you taught us, the first thing I learned was the word overdeterminism from you.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And you were, you know, Professor Alarcón was my advisor. She was on my committees, a mentor. I taught your work as a philosophy professor. I taught feminist philosophy for years. I taught your article on the Lynche was had a huge impact on my students. And you know, I just this month I'm thinking about something I'm writing, and I'm thinking about something that I learned from you or I heard from you so many years ago. You mentioned to me that we were detribalized Indians. And I remember at the time, I didn't want to hear it. I was like, I don't know what she's talking about. I'm not detribalized. And and it's only now, you know, 20 years later that I finally understand what you were saying.
I mean, nobody might believe it, but I'm detribalized.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think I wanted to believe that since I know my tribe, I'm not detribalized. But the reality is I am detribalized. And as an African, I'm detribalized as well. And so I'm really grateful for you know, that critical understanding. And also what you were talking today about Lugones also, you know, I could resonate with around my own experience growing up with the drunk Indians, you know, as an Indian living in places where there was just so much anti-native hostility, and it was always about, oh, the drunk Indians. And then me always like hanging out with the drunk Indians because they were Indian. That's all that mattered to me as a kid, right? I just wanted to be around some Indians and you know, and then hanging out with the bus drivers when I was a student, all the black bus drivers, because they were all philosophers, and I would sit on the bus and they would just educate me. Same with the drunk Indians. And so I really appreciated what you said about you know, the streetwalkers and the different, you know, epistemology. I wanted to ask about a statement you made. White supremacist Christians are in a panic now because we are luminous. I'd love to hear more about that. To me, it's reminding me of like Black Lives Matter and Standing Rock movements that have been so powerful lately. And then also, I think I wanted to hear what you had to say. You're talking about language and how we need a new rhetoric, and there's so many simplistic rhetorics being used now from on both sides, on all sides. Like I know there's no binary, there's no both sides, but right, Black Lives Matter, very simple, right? I don't know more, Standing Rock, right? Very simple rhetoric. Trump, very simple rhetoric. So I'd like to also know what you have to say about that. What is this move to this simplistic?
Well, as I said, we have to see how we can disrupt binary logic. And what is the difference that you're bringing into play? It could be your own body, or it could be some concept or notion you derive from vis-a-vis your own experience, your lived experience. What is that difference that disrupts the binary logic that surrounds you? Okay? The dichotomous thinking that has been part of our heritage. How do you disrupt it? And once you disrupt it, where are you going with it? Are you going to suggest another concept that is more apropos, that is more livable? I mean, can you live with the concepts that you are heir to? Of course not. So how do you throw them out? You have to change the vocabulary. You have to change the grammar. You have to change the grammar of our times. And this is a long-range project. So start thinking about it, Jennifer. I know you got a lot of good papers in you. And in terms of what you say, you know, the streetwalker or the one that hangs out with the drunks, the whatever they are, whoever they are, and listens to them, and actually listen to them, you can grasp their imagery, the way in which things are juxtaposed with each other, the way they speak and trying to as it were, affirm themselves to you or express themselves to you. And when you take it out of the context of the street, let's just talk about it that way. When you take it and you think about it, you know that a lot of that is being expressed. And it becomes part of your work, as it were, to interpret that. In fact, I didn't mention her today, but Emma Perez's The Decolonial Imaginary posits a very interesting way in which you can look at the past and discover, as it were, the ancestors you want. Because if you're detribalized, you may no longer have the ancestors you want, but you can seek them out. And in Emma Perez's Decolonial Imaginary, what she suggests is that you can discover the activity and activism of previous women in our history, that you can interpret what they were doing in terms of a decolonial gesture on their part that did not survive as such, because it's a concept we're playing around with at this moment. Colonialism has been used a great deal over the centuries, but the idea of decolonizing has not. And Emma Perez makes suggestion. She's in search of, shall we say, recovering the Chicanas of the past, who were actually activists and feminists, but have disappeared because nobody paid attention at all. But what she calls us to do from our lens, from the present, is to see whether they were making an effort and being active about transforming their reality. And how when you listen to other people, whether it be in the street or someplace else, who don't write, who are not a public speaker, who do not necessarily aspire to be in the public sphere, It does not mean that they do not provide us with images and forms of speaking that will pierce their reality in front of them, and that's one thing that you can do as well. Interpret what is being said, especially when it's in metaphors and imagery and so on, which many drunk anything have at their command. But they will never make it to a public sphere. Well, they do, but it's not acceptable. Anyway.
Not in their own words, they don't.
Yes, right.
Norma,
their own words, yes.
Yeah, it's 1:45, and I know, and we were to end at 1:30. There are a couple of questions. I can save the chat and share them with you. Manuel had a question about how your work critically engaged continental philosophy, and what about continental philosophers taking up Chicana feminism? That, I think, is a great question. Once again, if you have time, if you want to speak to it, but we're also running short on time. And then Cristina Acosta has a beautiful poem here. Once again, I can download the chat and I can share that with you. So I don't know if you want to speak to the question, or if it's time for us to sign off. I'm going to leave it to you.
Well, let me start out by saying how that according to Foucault, I guess I engage, Manuel, according to Foucault, Deleuze and Guattari were the last anti-philosophers. In other words, the cadre of philosophical thinkers, of the continental philosophical thinkers, I always ask myself why I don't engage with the British, but I think I know. The continental philosophical thinkers, according to Foucault, had come to philosophy had come to an end with some of his contemporaries that had blown it apart. And Deleuze and Guattari were some of them, of those post-structuralists that had blown apart philosophy as we knew it. Of course, philosophy as they knew it may have been over for them, and they tore it apart as much as they could in their texts. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's as we knew it with respect to the disciplinary department. But I would take heart from the fact that philosophy as we knew it is over. It's just going to take a long while for everybody to get it. I think that answers a question about how I engage with continental philosophers. They gave me hope.
Well,
but these white extremists are giving me despair.
Well, and what do you think when continental philosophers take up Chicana theory? I think that was the other piece of Manuel's question. Yeah.
That it's over.
Who is the one? Who is the one that has taken up Chicana theory? I mean, who is the specific one?
Oh, Manuel, do you want to share?
Very specifically, Catherine Malibu has taken up Florian Sandua's work on borderlands in a very favorable way in her own work.
How recent is her is it 21st century?
2019, yes.
Okay. Yeah, Gloria has become international. Okay. There have been symposiums in France, there have been symposiums in Brazil, they have been all kinds, and her publications are also traveling. I would expect more takes from Europeans on Gloria Saldúa because, as I said, there's a new French translation of Borderlands. It's coming out soon. It's not out yet. But I think French women like her would probably take it up. Gloria has become very relevant with this question of borderlands as a result of the breakup of the Soviet Union, the borders that have been created as a result of that, the fact that borders are contested all over the map, all over the globe, that nations are getting partitioned and bordered, and so that her ideas about borders and experience have become in the past 10 years, I would guess, about 10 years, have become global, have been taken up globally. So it's kind of hard to say, you know, what our assessment is of their reading of Gloria. And I'm not reading bad intentions here, because obviously one wouldn't have critical editions or translate it into French with critical markers if you didn't want it to circulate globally. And she has become very popular. She has a lot of ideas to share. And the border thing is very important.
Gracias, Norma. I know that we're over time, and we want to thank everybody for coming in for the take two. And we just want to take a deep breath with you. We want to take a deep breath with you to exhale the negative energy and inhale all of the good energy that you shared with us. We want to ask folks to turn on their cameras so that we can take a picture of this her historical, queer historical, their historical moment. So if you want to turn on your camera, that would be wonderful. And I'll take a couple of shots of us. I did hide non-video participants, so if your video's not on, then you won't come out. So just cleans up the space. Gracias, Norma.
Thank you, Rita.
All right, 1, 2, 3. One more in case you closed your eyes. 1, 2, 3. All right. Gracias to all of you. We thank all of the people who have loved Norma, who have taken care of you, who are still taking care of you. We thank all of the people who have taken care of Dion and all of your ancestors and all of the people who take care of you today, tomorrow, and always, because you have created a wonderful space for us today. Thank you. And take care, everybody. Cuídense.
Thank you.
Thank you.